The human brain is the most powerful system evolution has ever created, yet it is also the easiest to exhaust, the easiest to break, and the only organ capable of destroying itself without any external force. It built civilization, predicted the future, imagined gods and machines, but in exchange it lost the ability to feel safe inside its own thoughts, because the same mechanism that allows the brain to see beyond the present also forces it to live in dangers that do not exist. Threats that have not arrived, losses that may never happen. So, if this power was the greatest evolutionary advantage humanity ever gained, why did it come with a fragility so deep that a single thought can steal our sleep? Because the human brain did not become powerful by becoming calm, it became powerful by becoming predictive, by learning to simulate reality faster than reality itself, and every layer of that prediction added survival value while quietly removing certainty. The brain learned to ask what if before danger arrived. But it never learned when to stop asking. And this is the origin point we must keep returning to. The brain's power is its ability to escape the present, and its fragility is the price of never fully returning to it. At some point in evolution, the human brain crossed a threshold no other species crossed, a point where perception was no longer limited to what the eyes saw or the ears heard, but expanded into imagined futures, remembered pasts, and hypothetical losses, and from that moment on, survival no longer depended only on muscles or speed, but on mental simulations that could prevent danger before it existed. This is why the brain became powerful. It could suffer in advance to avoid suffering later, and this mechanism worked so well that it reshaped the entire species. But every time the brain ran a simulation of danger that never arrived, the nervous system still paid the cost, because the body cannot distinguish between a threat that is real and a threat that is vividly imagined. This is where fragility enters, not as a defect, but as an unavoidable consequence of power. The brain that can model the future must also react to it, and reaction without resolution accumulates, slowly draining the system from the inside. This is why the human brain is the only organ that can collapse under safety, because when external threats disappear, the predictive machinery does not turn off. It simply turns inward. The same ability that once scanned the horizon for predators now scans memory, identity, and possibility, generating internal threats that feel just as urgent. The brain remains powerful because it never stops predicting, and it becomes fragile because prediction without closure becomes burden. If we strip this mechanism away, the brain would lose its power to imagine, to plan, to create, to anticipate, and humanity as we know it would vanish. But if we leave it unchecked, the brain exhausts itself under the weight of futures that never come, which brings us back to the same cold paradox. The human brain is fragile precisely because it cannot afford to stop being powerful. And this fragility does not appear suddenly. It accumulates quietly because a brain built to predict danger never receives a clear signal that danger has ended. In early evolution, a threat either arrived or it did not, and once it passed, the body returned to baseline. But the modern human brain rarely experiences this resolution, since imagined futures have no natural ending point, and the mechanism that made the brain powerful enough to anticipate reality now keeps it suspended in permanent preparation. This is the first concrete loss hidden inside the brain's power. The loss of a clear boundary between threat and safety, because prediction erases the present and replaces it with possibility. The brain became powerful by compressing time, by pulling the future into the present and replaying the past inside the same mental space. But this compression came at a cost the species could not foresee. When the brain learned to simulate tomorrow, it also learned to feel tomorrow's pain today. And once this ability existed, evolution could not remove it without destroying everything it had built on top of it. This is why fragility is not an accident. It is structural. The brain is not fragile because it fails to cope with modern life. It is fragile because its core function requires it to remain open, sensitive, and unfinished. Every prediction the brain generates is a form of incomplete action. The system prepares, mobilizes energy, and waits, But when the imagined event never arrives, the preparation has nowhere to go. Over time, these unresolved preparations pile up, not as memories, but as tension. This is why the human brain tires, even in stillness. Because stillness offers no closure to a system designed for anticipation. The brain's power lies in its ability to stay ahead of reality, and its fragility lies in the fact that reality can never fully catch up. This is also why the human brain cannot simply rest when the body rests. Sleep does not switch the brain off. It merely shifts the arena in which prediction occurs. Dreams are not random images. They are the brain attempting to discharge unfinished simulations, to reconcile imagined futures with stored memories, to reduce the internal load created by its own power. But even sleep has limits. Because a brain that never stops predicting will always generate more material than sleep can resolve. The stronger the predictive machinery, the heavier the unresolved residue it leaves behind. At this point, the paradox tightens. If the brain reduced its predictive depth, it would become calmer, but also less capable of complex planning, creativity, and abstract reasoning. Civilization itself is a direct extension of this mental ability to operate beyond the present, to build structures for futures that do not yet exist. The brain paid for civilization with stability, trading immediate peace for long-term control, and once this exchange occurred, there was no evolutionary path back. Fragility became the tax on power, paid continuously, generation after generation. The cold truth is that the human brain did not evolve to be comfortable. It evolved to be effective. Comfort requires closure, repetition, and predictability, while effectiveness requires openness, uncertainty, and constant recalibration. The brain that could survive by imagining loss before it happened became a brain that could never fully relax, because relaxation offers no advantage to a system whose strength lies in readiness. This is why even in moments of safety, the brain searches for problems, because a brain without problems loses the very function that made it powerful. This mechanism also explains why the brain is uniquely vulnerable to itself. Other organs fail under physical strain, but the brain can fail under abstraction alone. A thought carries no mass, yet it can activate the same physiological response as a real threat, and this ability is inseparable from the brain's power to represent reality internally. The more accurately the brain models the world, the more convincing its internal threats become, and the more fragile the system grows under its own accuracy. As societies removed immediate dangers from daily life, the brain did not downgrade its predictive machinery. Instead, it redirected it. Without predators, famine, or constant physical risk, prediction turned towards social standing, identity, meaning. These are abstract threats with no clear resolution, which means the brain remains perpetually engaged. The power that once ensured survival now sustains internal conflict, not because the brain is malfunctioning, but because it is functioning exactly as designed in an environment that offers no final answers. This is the evolutionary loss that rarely gets named, the loss of a stopping point. A powerful brain cannot easily accept ambiguity without cost, because ambiguity demands continuous simulation. The brain stays powerful by refusing to settle, and it becomes fragile by refusing to stop. Every unanswered question keeps the predictive loop alive, and modern life is built almost entirely out of unanswered questions. The more complex the world becomes, the more the brain must project itself forward, and the heavier the burden of its own power grows. If the brain were weaker, it would accept the present more easily, but it would also lose the capacity that defines humanity. If it were stronger still, its predictive reach would expand further, but so would its vulnerability. Because fragility scales with power, this means there is no stable peak, no point at which the brain becomes powerful enough to be free from its own costs. The system is trapped in its own success, and this trap is not psychological, cultural, or technological. It is evolutionary, and so the question keeps returning, tighter each time, because it has no resolution. If the human brain's greatest strength is its ability to escape the present, and its greatest weakness is its inability to remain there, then was this power ever meant to be carried without consequence? Or is fragility the unavoidable shadow of a mind capable of seeing beyond now? That shadow deepens when we look at what the brain must sacrifice in order to maintain this level of power, because prediction does not come for free. It demands constant openness to error, and an open system is, by definition, unstable. A brain that closes itself to uncertainty would gain peace, but it would lose adaptability. And adaptability is the core reason this organ became dominant in the first place. The human brain survives by remaining unfinished, and an unfinished system is always vulnerable to overload. This is not a malfunction that appeared later. It is the original design constraint hidden inside intelligence itself. The moment the brain learned to treat the future as something real enough to prepare for, it accepted a permanent imbalance. Preparation mobilizes energy, heightens awareness, and sharpens perception. But without a clear endpoint, these states never fully resolve. In early human environments, preparation ended with action or escape. The body moved, the threat passed, and equilibrium returned. Today, preparation often ends with nothing at all. The imagined event dissolves, but the internal state lingers, and the brain carries the residue forward. This accumulation is not weakness. It is deferred power with nowhere to be spent. This explains why the brain feels most fragile not during danger, but during safety. When danger is real, the predictive loop completes itself. When danger is abstract, the loop remains open. A powerful brain generates more abstract danger than it can ever discharge, because abstraction has no physical boundary. The system becomes overloaded not because it lacks strength, but because its strength creates more possibilities than reality can satisfy. The more scenarios the brain can imagine, the fewer of them will ever resolve. And fragility emerges from this imbalance between capacity and closure. Even the sense of self is shaped by this mechanism. Identity is a long-term prediction, a story the brain tells itself about continuity across time. This allows humans to plan decades ahead, to sacrifice now for later, to build lives rather than moments. But identity is also fragile because it depends on imagined futures remaining coherent. When those futures fracture or multiply, the brain must hold incompatible versions of itself at once. The same cognitive reach that makes long-term purpose possible also makes internal conflict inevitable. Power expands the self, and fragility follows it inward. This is why attempts to simplify the human mind often fail. You cannot remove fragility without dulling the very capacities that define the species. A brain that feels less would also imagine less. A brain that predicts less would create less. Every effort to reduce vulnerability without touching power misunderstands the structure of the system. The two are not opposites. They are the same mechanism seen from different angles. Power is prediction, and fragility is prediction without rest. The deeper truth is colder still. Evolution does not optimize for well-being. It optimizes for persistence. A brain that can endure discomfort while expanding control will outcompete a brain that seeks balance. The human brain persisted because it tolerated instability in exchange for dominance. From an evolutionary perspective, fragility was an acceptable cost. The species survived, spread, and transformed its environment, even if individual minds struggled under the weight of that success. What feels like a flaw at the personal level is a feature at the species level. This perspective reframes the entire question. The brain is not powerful despite being fragile. It is powerful because it accepts fragility as the price of reach. Every expansion of mental territory increases exposure. A system that can represent more of the world internally must also absorb more uncertainty, more ambiguity, and more unresolved tension. Strength, in this context, is not resilience. It is range, and range always comes with risk. As predictive capacity increased, the brain also became more dependent on meaning, because meaning acts as a stabilizer for endless possibility. When the brain cannot close prediction through action, it attempts to close it through explanation. Stories, beliefs, and narratives are not secondary features of intelligence. They are structural supports that keep a powerful brain from fragmenting under its own openness. Remove meaning, and the predictive system loses orientation. Add too many meanings, and it collapses under contradiction. Fragility lives in this narrow corridor between coherence and overload. The modern world intensifies this tension by multiplying futures faster than the brain can integrate them. Every option creates a branch. Every branch demands evaluation, and evaluation consumes the same mental resources that once tracked survival. The brain did not become fragile because the world became complex. The world became complex because the brain became capable of sustaining complexity. The causal arrow runs in the opposite direction. Civilization is the external expression of internal prediction, and its weight presses back onto the system that created it. When viewed this way, exhaustion becomes a signal, not of failure, but of saturation. A powerful brain eventually reaches the limits of how much unrealized future it can hold. Fragility appears when prediction outpaces embodiment, when thought outruns action, and when imagination expands faster than resolution. This is why stillness can feel heavier than movement, and why rest can be difficult even when nothing is wrong. The brain remains oriented toward what could be, not what is, because that orientation is the source of its strength. So the question cannot be answered by choosing between power and fragility. The human brain does not oscillate between these states. It occupies them simultaneously. Its greatest achievements and its deepest vulnerabilities arise from the same evolutionary bargain. To ask why the brain is so fragile is to ask why it is so powerful, because one cannot exist without the other. The organ that escaped the present did so at the cost of being able to remain inside it. And as this realization settles, the question sharpens rather than resolves, because if fragility is not a flaw but a consequence, then what does it mean to protect a system whose strength depends on remaining exposed? And how does a mind built to live ahead of time ever find rest without surrendering the very power that made it human? That question becomes heavier when we recognize that the brain cannot simply choose to retreat from its own power, because power is not a setting that can be adjusted. It is a structural condition. The human brain does not activate prediction only when needed. It exists inside prediction at all times. Even moments that feel calm are framed by background simulations, quiet evaluations of what might come next. This constant forward reach is the reason the brain can navigate complex social systems, long-term cooperation, and abstract goals. And it is also the reason the brain never fully returns to neutrality. Fragility emerges not from excess thinking, but from continuous thinking without a natural endpoint. In earlier evolutionary contexts, the predictive brain was balanced by physical demand. Anticipation led to movement, and movement led to resolution. The body completed what the mind began. In modern conditions, prediction often leads nowhere. The brain prepares, but the body remains still. This separation is crucial because the brain's power evolved alongside action, not isolation. When prediction is decoupled from embodiment, it accumulates rather than dissipates. The system grows powerful in representation but fragile in regulation, because the loop that once closed itself through action now remains open indefinitely. This reveals another hidden loss inside intelligence: the loss of proportionality. The brain can now generate responses far larger than the situations that trigger them. A small uncertainty can provoke a cascade of imagined consequences, each one demanding attention. The predictive system does not scale down automatically. Once it learned to model worst-case scenarios, it retained that capacity even when the environment no longer required it. Fragility is the mismatch between the scale of internal response and the scale of external reality. And that mismatch increases as the brain's modeling power grows. The brain's sensitivity is often described as a weakness, but sensitivity is simply precision extended inward. A powerful brain detects subtle patterns, small changes, and faint signals. This is what allows learning, creativity, and innovation. But when sensitivity turns inward, the same precision amplifies internal noise. Thoughts are examined, emotions are scrutinized, and minor fluctuations are interpreted as significant. The system becomes powerful at detecting itself, and that self-detection generates instability. A brain that can observe its own processes gains depth, but it also gains vulnerability to feedback loops it cannot easily escape. Self-awareness, one of the highest expressions of brain power, is also one of its most destabilizing features. To be aware of one's own mind is to exist one step removed from the present moment. The brain observes itself thinking, and in doing so, creates an additional layer of prediction. The brain is no longer only predicting the world, it is predicting its own reactions to the world. Power expands inward, and fragility follows it there, because each layer of observation adds distance from immediate experience. This distance has consequences. A system that constantly reflects on itself struggles to inhabit the present fully. The present becomes thin, overshadowed by interpretation. The brain's power to extract meaning from experience also extracts it from immediacy. This is not a philosophical abstraction, it is a functional outcome of prediction. The more the brain models, the less it simply receives. And when reception diminishes, rest becomes difficult, because rest requires a temporary suspension of evaluation. A powerful brain resists suspension, because suspension feels like loss of control. Control is another axis along which power and fragility intersect. Prediction evolved to increase control over outcomes. The more accurately the brain could anticipate, the more effectively it could influence. But control depends on uncertainty existing outside the system. When uncertainty is internalized, control turns against itself. The brain attempts to manage its own unpredictability, generating more prediction to regulate prediction. This recursive effort consumes resources without producing resolution. Fragility appears as fatigue, not because the brain lacks capacity, but because it is applying its capacity to itself. This inward turn explains why the brain can suffer without external cause. Pain does not require injury, it requires meaning. The brain's power to assign significance transforms neutral signals into sources of distress. This same mechanism allows empathy, moral reasoning, and complex social bonds. Without it, humanity would lose depth. With it, the brain carries a constant interpretive load. Fragility is the cumulative effect of meaning-making without pause. The brain becomes heavy not from what happens, but from what could happen, what might happen, and what once happened being replayed indefinitely. From an evolutionary perspective, this trade-off was acceptable. A species capable of anticipating abstract threats could outmaneuver competitors, cooperate across large groups, and reshape its environment. Individual discomfort did not outweigh collective advantage. The brain's power scaled at the species level, while fragility manifested at the individual level. Evolution selects for outcomes, not experiences. The human brain became powerful enough to dominate, even if that power created internal strain. Fragility was invisible to selection because it did not prevent reproduction or survival at the group scale. This is why there is no evolutionary correction waiting to happen. The brain cannot revert to a simpler state without losing the very capacities that define modern humanity. Any reduction in predictive power would reduce vulnerability, but it would also reduce imagination, foresight, and cultural complexity. The system is locked into its trajectory. Power and fragility are not separate traits that can be balanced independently. They are two expressions of the same adaptive solution. The brain did not accidentally become fragile. It became fragile as a direct result of succeeding too well. Understanding this reframes the question once more. The issue is not how to eliminate fragility, but how to coexist with it without misunderstanding it as failure. A powerful brain will always feel heavy at times, because it carries more than the present. The weight of imagined futures, remembered pasts, and symbolic meaning cannot be removed without dismantling the structure that holds them. Fragility is the signal that the system is operating at its upper limit, not that it is broken. As this realization settles, the paradox loses none of its sharpness. The human brain remains extraordinary, capable of abstraction, creation, and transformation beyond any other known system. And it remains uniquely vulnerable, precisely because it must stay open to possibility in order to function. Power expands the horizon, and fragility grows in its shadow. The question, therefore, does not fade. It deepens. If the brain's power depends on remaining exposed to uncertainty, and its fragility emerges from that exposure, then what does it mean to live inside a system that cannot close itself without losing its strength? And how does a mind built to carry futures ever learn to set them down? Because the moment the brain attempts to close itself, to seal off uncertainty completely, it does not become stable, it becomes smaller. And reduction is something this system was never designed to survive. The human brain evolved under constant pressure to remain open, scanning, anticipating, revising, and this openness is not an optional feature but the core mechanism behind intelligence itself. Every insight, every invention, every abstract leap depended on the brain remaining permeable to what might happen next, and fragility emerges exactly at that point of openness, not after it. This is why the brain does not fail when it becomes fragile. It signals that it is operating near the upper edge of its evolutionary design. Other organs degrade when overloaded, but the brain reacts differently. It becomes hyper-aware, hypersensitive, increasingly reactive to signals that once would have been filtered out. This is not damage in the conventional sense. It is amplification without proportional release. The system that once tracked predators, weather patterns, and social threats now tracks reputations, imagined futures, symbolic meanings, and abstract risks that have no clear endpoint. Power expands faster than resolution, and the imbalance grows quietly. At this point, it becomes clear that fragility is not caused by weakness, but by excess capacity. The brain can represent more than it can resolve. It can imagine losses that cannot be grieved, futures that cannot be reached, and responsibilities that cannot be discharged. Each unresolved representation remains active in the neural landscape, consuming attention, energy, and emotional bandwidth. The body continues to respond as if action is required, but no action exists that can complete the loop. This is the core failure point we must keep returning to. A predictive system without sufficient closure mechanisms will always trend toward overload. Evolution never needed to solve this problem. For most of human history, external pressure provided natural resolution. Threats arrived, decisions were made, outcomes occurred, and the predictive cycle closed. In modern environments, however, the brain is surrounded by symbolic inputs that never fully resolve. News, imagined scenarios, long-term risks, identity concerns, and abstract obligations accumulate without clear endpoints. The brain remains powerful because it can process all of this, but it becomes fragile because processing does not equal completion. The system was built to act, not to endlessly simulate. This explains why the most cognitively advanced species is also uniquely vulnerable to anxiety, rumination, and internal collapse. The brain's strength lies in its ability to model complexity. But complexity without execution becomes burden. When the brain cannot convert prediction into action, it cannot discharge the physiological cost of anticipation. Stress becomes chronic not because danger is constant, but because prediction never resolves. Fragility emerges not from threat, but from suspended readiness. Returning again to the central cause, the brain's power is inseparable from its tendency to remain open-ended. Intelligence requires keeping possibilities alive, but every kept possibility carries metabolic and emotional cost. The more futures the brain can hold, the more weight it carries simultaneously. This is why intelligence does not bring peace by default. It brings range. A mind capable of holding only the present rarely collapses, but a mind capable of holding dozens of hypothetical selves must constantly negotiate which ones matter, which ones can be released, and which ones demand action. The fragility becomes most visible when the brain turns its predictive capacity inward. Once survival depends less on external threats, the system redirects its modeling power toward identity, meaning, and self-evaluation. The brain begins to predict not just events, but judgments, failures, and imagined perceptions of others. These predictions cannot be acted upon in the physical sense, yet they still activate the same threat response circuitry. The brain remains powerful because it can simulate entire social realities, but it becomes fragile because those simulations rarely end. This internalization marks a critical shift in the evolutionary logic. The brain that once protected the body now increasingly threatens it through internal load, not because the system is malfunctioning, but because it is operating exactly as designed in an environment it was never optimized for. Predictive intelligence assumed scarcity, immediacy, and resolution. Modern symbolic environments offer abundance, delay, and ambiguity. The mismatch does not reduce power. It multiplies strain. Understanding this reframes fragility entirely. It is not a sign that the brain is poorly built, but that it is overqualified. The system has exceeded the constraints that once kept its processes balanced. Power without boundaries becomes self-consuming. The brain cannot simply choose to become less predictive without losing the very capacities that define humanity. Creativity, foresight, empathy, and abstraction all arise from the same openness that generates vulnerability. This leads to a colder, more uncomfortable realization. There may be no stable configuration in which the human brain remains maximally powerful and permanently at ease. Stability requires closure. Power requires openness. Evolution optimized for survival and adaptation, not for psychological comfort. Fragility is therefore not an accident, but a structural trade-off embedded at the core of cognition. And this brings us back, once again, to the question that cannot be resolved without cost. If the human brain's strength depends on remaining open to uncertainty, and its fragility emerges from that same openness, what does it actually mean to live inside a system that cannot fully rest without becoming something else entirely? And to move forward from that question, we have to abandon the comforting idea that the brain was ever meant to rest in the way we imagine rest. Biological rest was designed as a temporary suspension between actions, not as a permanent state of equilibrium. The human brain evolved to oscillate between tension and release, prediction and resolution, alertness and recovery. What has changed is not the brain itself, but the disappearance of reliable resolution. The system keeps preparing, but the world no longer provides clear moments where preparation can end. This is why modern fragility feels so different from physical exhaustion. Muscles recover when work stops. Wounds heal when threats disappear. But predictive load does not fade simply because the body is safe. The brain continues to run scenarios because safety itself has become abstract. Safety is no longer the absence of immediate danger. It is a probability estimate about an uncertain future. As long as safety is framed as something that might be lost, the brain remains vigilant. At this point, it becomes necessary to return again to the root cause. The human brain is powerful because it can hold the future in mind, but it is fragile because the future has no natural stopping point. Every imagined future branches into more futures, each demanding evaluation. The system was never designed to prune infinite possibility. It was designed to select among a small number of urgent options. When options multiply faster than decisions, the brain does not fail catastrophically. It erodes quietly. This erosion does not look like obvious malfunction. It looks like distraction, fatigue, emotional flattening, or constant low-level unease. It still reasons, plans, creates, but each function costs more energy than before, because the background noise of unresolved prediction never fully shuts down. Fragility, here, is not collapse, but inefficiency born of overload. The engine runs, but it overheats under its own sophistication. This is also why attempts to fix the brain often fail. Techniques that aim to eliminate uncertainty misunderstand the source of the problem. Removing uncertainty would remove the very fuel of intelligence. The brain does not become powerful by certainty, but by flexibility. A system that knows exactly what will happen next has no need to think. Intelligence arises from gaps, from unknowns, from the need to simulate alternatives. Fragility arises when those alternatives never narrow. Evolution tolerated this because, for most of history, narrowing happened naturally. Hunger ended with food. Threats ended with escape or death. Social conflict ended with resolution or separation. Today, many pressures never end. They merely change form. The brain keeps tracking them because it cannot classify them as complete. Power remains active. Fragility accumulates. We can see this most clearly in how the brain treats meaning. Meaning is not a physical object. It cannot be consumed, escaped, or discharged. Once the brain begins to predict meaning, it cannot stop. It asks what events imply, how actions will be interpreted, what identity they construct. These predictions do not resolve through action alone. Even success generates new interpretations, new expectations, new risks. The brain's power to construct meaning therefore guarantees ongoing load. This brings us back, once more, to the evolutionary trade-off. The same architecture that allows humans to build civilizations, transmit knowledge across generations, and imagine realities that do not yet exist, also ensures that the brain never fully settles. Fragility is not a flaw layered on top of intelligence. It is the shadow intelligence casts when it extends beyond immediate survival. At this stage, the question shifts subtly but critically. The issue is no longer why the brain is fragile, but why we expect it not to be. We measure the brain against an ideal of constant calm that evolution never promised. We interpret strain as malfunction instead of as evidence of capacity pushed beyond its original ecological niche. The brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do: remain open, responsive, adaptive. The cost is that openness cannot be selectively closed without consequence. This understanding reframes vulnerability as a signal rather than a defect. Fragility indicates that the system is holding more than it was ever meant to carry alone. It is the sign of excess awareness without sufficient grounding. The brain does not ask to be less powerful. It asks for constraints, for endpoints, for moments where prediction can safely end. Without those, it continues, because stopping would mean abandoning its core function. And this brings us toward a deeper, more uncomfortable layer of the question. If fragility is not something to be eliminated without sacrificing intelligence, then the real challenge is not repair, but coexistence. How does a species live inside a mind that must remain open to function, knowing that openness guarantees strain? How do you inhabit a system that cannot fully protect itself from its own strengths? From here, the direction of the exploration will begin to narrow toward how this power-fragility dynamic expresses itself in sleep, emotion, attention, and long-term mental sustainability. But before crossing into that territory, it is important to recognize that we are approaching the structural midpoint of the video's total length. Because the moment the brain begins to protect itself too aggressively, it also begins to narrow, and narrowing is the slow erosion of the very capacity that made it human in the first place. A brain that closes itself to reduce pain also closes itself to possibility. This is why fragility persists even when comfort increases. Comfort removes physical threat, but it does not reduce cognitive exposure. In many cases, it expands it. With fewer immediate dangers to solve, the brain turns inward and forward, filling the empty space with simulations, comparisons, and imagined futures. Here, the root cause surfaces again. The human brain is powerful not because it reacts well, but because it anticipates endlessly. Anticipation is not a feature that can be switched off when inconvenient. It is the default mode of a system designed to survive by seeing what is not yet real. Fragility emerges when anticipation outlives its usefulness. The brain keeps asking, "What if?" long after what now has been answered. This is why mental strain often appears strongest in moments of apparent stability. When survival becomes predictable, prediction does not disappear. It loses its anchor. The brain continues to scan for significance because significance once meant survival. In the absence of clear threats, it begins to manufacture abstract ones: social standing, future regret, unrealized potential, identity coherence. None of them resolve conclusively. Power remains active. Fragility compounds. To understand how deeply embedded this is, we have to look at how the brain treats time. The human brain is not optimized for the present. It is optimized for extended temporal awareness. It can carry the past forward and pull the future backward into the present moment. This temporal compression is the source of learning, planning, and culture. But it is also the source of chronic load. The brain does not experience time as a sequence of completed moments. It experiences time as overlapping layers that never fully clear. Again, the same paradox returns. Strength and vulnerability arise from the same mechanism. A brain that could only live in the present would feel lighter, calmer, and less strained, but it would also be incapable of cumulative knowledge, long-term cooperation, or moral abstraction. Fragility is not accidental. It is the price paid for continuity across time. This helps explain why the brain reacts so poorly to environments that lack clear rhythm. Natural cycles, day and night. Hunger and satiety, effort and rest, once provided external boundaries that told the brain when to disengage. Modern environments blur these boundaries. Light extends the day. Information never sleeps. Social feedback loops remain open indefinitely. The brain receives no reliable signal that prediction can stop. It continues, because stopping would mean missing something important. Power stays engaged. Fragility deepens quietly. At this point, it is crucial to restate the central cause plainly. The human brain is fragile because it cannot fully disengage from its own projections without sacrificing its defining capabilities. Any system that can imagine loss before it occurs will feel loss in advance. Any system that can simulate failure will experience it emotionally even when nothing has gone wrong. This is not malfunction. It is overextension of a highly successful design. The tragedy is that the brain interprets this overextension as personal weakness. Individuals experience fragility as something internal and defective, rather than as the predictable outcome of a brain operating beyond the conditions it evolved for. The system was calibrated for intermittent danger and clear resolution, not for constant low-level uncertainty and infinite comparison. Yet it adapts, because adaptation is what it does, even when adaptation itself becomes the source of strain. This is why resilience, as commonly defined, often fails to address the real issue. Teaching the brain to endure more does not reduce fragility. It often increases it. Endurance keeps the system running under load without addressing why the load never clears. The brain does not need to become tougher in the traditional sense. It needs structures that allow prediction to complete, to land, to rest. Without that, power remains active and fragility becomes chronic. Notice how the question has subtly evolved again. We are no longer asking why the brain breaks. We are asking why it keeps going. The answer loops back to the same point every time, because to stop would be to lose the very thing that makes it powerful. The brain cannot selectively abandon anticipation without diminishing intelligence itself. From here, the exploration will naturally move toward the systems that evolved to manage this tension. Sleep, emotional regulation, attentional narrowing not as luxuries, but as compensatory mechanisms. They are not upgrades, they are pressure valves, and when those valves fail or are overridden, fragility becomes visible. We are still moving forward along the same axis, and the underlying cause has not changed. The human brain is powerful because it must remain open to the future, and it is fragile because the future never ends. And that endless future is precisely where the brain's most delicate systems begin to show strain. Not because they are weak, but because they are doing a job that never truly finishes. To manage this, evolution layered additional mechanisms on top of raw anticipation, not to eliminate it, but to contain it. Sleep, emotion, and attention are not separate features. They are containment strategies. They exist to narrow the field of prediction temporarily so the system does not collapse under its own reach. Sleep, in particular, is often misunderstood as rest for the body. During sleep, the system is forced to let go of immediate future simulation. Sensory input is reduced. Social evaluation pauses. The brain is allowed to reorganize without constantly asking what comes next. This is not optional maintenance. It is structural necessity. A brain that cannot disengage will continue predicting until prediction itself becomes noise. Here again, the root cause reappears clearly. The brain's power lies in continuous simulation. but that same continuity becomes destructive without interruption. Sleep does not exist to improve performance alone. It exists to prevent runaway cognition. Fragility increases when sleep is shortened, fragmented, or delayed because the brain is denied its only reliable off switch. Power remains active when it should be cycling down. Emotion serves a similar function, though in a different way. Emotions compress complex predictions into simplified signals. Fear narrows the future to a single threat. Joy narrows it to a single reward. Sadness slows prediction by lowering perceived possibility. These states are not irrational. They are regulatory shortcuts. They reduce cognitive load by temporarily collapsing many potential futures into one dominant narrative. Fragility increases when emotional signals are suppressed or prolonged unnaturally, because the brain loses its ability to narrow efficiently. Attention is the third containment mechanism. Attention is not about focusing harder. It is about excluding. By attending to one thing, the brain ignores countless others. This selective blindness is essential. Without it, every possible outcome would demand equal consideration. Modern environments, however, constantly fracture attention. The brain is pulled across competing futures without resolution. It does not fail dramatically. It thins out. Concentration weakens. Fatigue appears earlier. Fragility becomes ambient. At this stage, the pattern should be unmistakable. Every system designed to manage the brain's power relies on limitation. Limitation is not a flaw. It is protection. When limitation is removed or overridden, when sleep is shortened, emotion is numbed, attention is fragmented, the brain's raw power is exposed without insulation. The result feels like vulnerability, but it is actually overexposure. This brings us back, once more, to the central paradox. The human brain is powerful because it can operate without immediate constraints, but it is fragile because it requires constraints to remain stable. Intelligence expands the horizon, but stability depends on narrowing it again. Evolution balanced these opposing needs imperfectly because the environments that shaped the brain provided natural boundaries. Modern life does not. The brain does not recognize that the rules have changed. It continues to behave as though unresolved futures are dangerous, as though missed information could be fatal, as though social evaluation requires constant monitoring. These instincts were once adaptive. Now they persist without clear payoff. Power stays engaged. Fragility accumulates. What makes this especially difficult is that the brain cannot easily distinguish between meaningful futures and hypothetical ones. A thought about potential failure activates many of the same systems as real threat. A thought about future loss triggers emotional and physiological responses, as if loss has already occurred. This is not a bug. It is the cost of a system that evolved to treat prediction as rehearsal for survival. But rehearsal without performance never ends. At this point, the question sharpens again. If fragility arises not from weakness, but from a mismatch between ancient design and modern conditions, then the problem is not individual brains failing, but an environment that keeps the brain permanently on. The brain is not broken, it is overstimulated by possibility. It is overloaded by futures that never resolve. And this leads toward a critical realization. Many of the experiences we label as mental decline, burnout, or emotional instability are not signs of deterioration, but signals of a system running at maximum scope for too long. The brain is doing what it does best, anticipating, evaluating, simulating, but without the external structure that once allowed those processes to conclude. We are now moving deeper into the second half of the video's conceptual arc, where the focus will begin to shift from evolutionary cause to lived consequence. How this power-fragility trade-off shapes daily experience, perception of self, and the modern struggle to feel mentally settled, because living inside such a system changes how reality itself is experienced. When prediction never fully shuts down, the present moment is no longer enough. The brain treats now as a staging area for what comes next. Even calm moments are scanned for future relevance. Rest becomes conditional. Enjoyment becomes provisional. The mind is always slightly elsewhere, not out of distraction, but out of function. This is where fragility becomes most personal. The brain begins to experience its own activity as pressure. Thoughts feel intrusive not because they are abnormal, but because they arrive without invitation and refuse to conclude. The system that once protected survival now fills silence with anticipation. Power expresses itself as mental momentum. Fragility appears as the inability to stop that momentum on command. Return again to the cause. A brain that can imagine futures cannot easily unimagine them. Once a possibility is generated, it leaves a trace. The more powerful the imagination, the more vivid the trace. Over time, the accumulation of traces creates cognitive residue, unfinished simulations that compete for attention. None are urgent enough to resolve. None are trivial enough to ignore. The brain carries them all. This explains why fragility often intensifies with intelligence and awareness. A richer model of the world produces more branches, more contingencies, more imagined outcomes. Each one demands evaluation. The brain becomes more accurate and more burdened at the same time. The self emerges inside this dynamic. Identity is not a fixed core. It is a story the brain predicts about its own continuity. Who you are is shaped by who you might become, who you fear becoming. These are future-oriented constructs. They do not rest. They require constant updating. The brain's power to maintain identity across time therefore introduces another layer of fragility. The fear of incoherence, of losing narrative control. Again, this is not optional. A species that plans across generations must maintain stable identities long enough to coordinate, teach, and transmit values. But stability achieved through prediction is inherently tense. The story must keep making sense. When circumstances shift faster than narratives can adapt, strain appears. The brain feels exposed, not because it lacks strength, but because its model of itself is under constant revision. Notice how often fragility is triggered not by danger, but by ambiguity. Clear threat produces action. Clear safety produces rest. Ambiguity produces rumination. The brain cannot classify the situation as complete, so it keeps running. Power stays active. Fragility grows quietly in the background. This is why the brain reacts so strongly to social uncertainty. Social systems are prediction engines. They require the brain to anticipate others' thoughts, reactions, and judgments. These predictions rarely resolve definitively. Every interaction opens new branches. Approval can be lost. Status can shift. Meaning can be misread. The brain treats these possibilities seriously because, historically, social exclusion meant death. The power to model others ensured survival. The fragility is the cost of carrying those models continuously. At this point, the core mechanism should be unmistakable. The human brain is fragile because it is permanently engaged in unfinished business. It is powerful because it refuses to stop anticipating. The environment no longer provides natural endpoints, so the system must invent its own and often fails to convince itself they are real. This failure does not announce itself dramatically. It appears as restlessness, low-grade anxiety, emotional numbness, or the sense that something is always slightly wrong. These are not signs of brokenness. They are signs of a brain operating without closure. The machine keeps running because it was never designed to idle indefinitely. The temptation is to blame modern technology, culture, or individual weakness. These factors matter, but they are not the root. They amplify a vulnerability that already existed the moment the brain crossed a certain threshold of foresight. Once a mind can live ahead of itself, it can also suffer ahead of itself. Power and fragility become inseparable. We must return, once again, to the central question: why is the human brain so powerful yet so fragile? Because the same architecture that allows it to escape the present also traps it there. It can see beyond immediate reality, but it cannot fully return once it does. The future is not a place it visits, it is a place it inhabits. From here, the next movement will deepen into how this constant future inhabitation reshapes perception of time, rest, and meaning at a physiological level, and why attempts to opt out often backfire by increasing internal pressure rather than releasing it. Because attempting to opt out of this future inhabiting mode often intensifies the very pressure it tries to escape. When the brain is told to stop thinking, it does not interpret this as relief. It interprets it as loss of critical information. Suppression becomes another prediction problem. What am I missing by not thinking? What risk am I ignoring? The system resumes scanning, now with added urgency. Power tightens, fragility sharpens. This is why avoidance rarely works. The brain does not relax when uncertainty is hidden. It relaxes when uncertainty is resolved or bounded. Distraction postpones load, but does not reduce it. When the distraction ends, the accumulated futures return, often with greater force. The brain has not forgotten. It has cued, return again to the cause. Anticipation is not a habit layered on top of cognition. It is cognition. The brain's primary job is to reduce surprise by simulating what could happen next. Every successful prediction reinforces the system. Every unresolved prediction remains open. Over time, open predictions outnumber closed ones. Physiologically, this shows up as a system that rarely reaches true baseline. Stress hormones do not spike dramatically, they hover. Neural networks do not shut down, they idle noisily. The brain expends energy maintaining readiness rather than executing action. This is metabolically expensive. The most powerful organ consumes disproportionate resources simply to remain prepared. Fragility is not emotional alone, it is energetic. The perception of time changes under these conditions. Moments are evaluated not for what they are, but for what they might lead to. Satisfaction becomes delayed indefinitely. Because completion is always provisional, there is always another layer of meaning to consider, another outcome to anticipate. Power keeps extending the horizon. Fragility grows in the gap between now and never. This is also where the modern obsession with optimization finds its grip. Optimization promises closure, the right choice, the best path, the most efficient self, but optimization multiplies futures instead of reducing them. Each improvement opens new standards, new comparisons, new risks of falling behind. The brain treats optimization as survival because, historically, better adaptation meant continued existence. Now, adaptation has no finish line. Power accelerates. Fragility follows. Again, this dynamic is not limited to pathology. It is present in creativity, ambition, and curiosity. The same brain that cannot stop worrying is the brain that cannot stop inventing. The line between generative tension and destructive strain is not fixed. It shifts with context, support, and boundary. Remove boundary long enough, and even creativity becomes exhausting. The engine runs hot. The question, then, is not whether fragility can be eliminated, but whether it can be metabolized. In ancestral environments, fragility was metabolized through action and resolution. Today, action often fails to close loops. Many efforts change probabilities rather than outcomes. The brain keeps track. It waits. It prepares. It does not stand down. This is why clarity, when it appears, feels disproportionately relieving. A clear decision, a definitive end, a non-negotiable boundary. These do not just reduce options. They allow prediction to stop. For a moment, the brain is permitted to rest because there is nothing left to simulate. Power disengages. Fragility recedes temporarily. Relief is not pleasure. It is silence. But silence is rare because silence requires constraint. And constraint feels dangerous to a system that equates openness with survival. The brain resists constraint instinctively, even when constraint would protect it. This is the final twist of the paradox. The brain fears the very limits it needs to remain stable. So we return, again and again, to the same core truth, because everything branches from it. The human brain is powerful because it can outpace the present, and fragile because it cannot easily return. Every attempt to explain the strain without acknowledging this, will circle endlessly around symptoms. The cause sits deeper, at the level of design. From here, the exploration will move toward what kinds of limits actually work, why some boundaries soothe while others provoke resistance, and how certain rhythms allow prediction to complete without diminishing intelligence. This is not about fixing the brain, but about giving it places to land. And those places to land are rarer than we assume, because not every boundary actually closes a prediction loop. Many limits look like limits on the surface, but leave the future open underneath. Rules that can be bent, goals that can be revised, identities that can be optimized indefinitely, all of these pretend to offer structure while quietly preserving uncertainty. The brain senses this immediately. It does not stand down. It keeps running. To understand what truly settles the brain, we have to return once more to the core mechanism. Prediction only stops when an outcome becomes non-negotiable. Finality, not control, is what quiets the system. This is why endings matter so deeply. An ending tells the brain that no further simulation is required. Whether the ending is good or bad is secondary. What matters is that it is closed. This explains why loss, despite its pain, often brings a strange clarity. Loss collapses futures. Possibilities disappear. The brain mourns, but it also rests, because there is nothing left to imagine in that direction. Fragility, in this case, does not come from loss itself, but from resisting the finality of loss. Power struggles against closure. When closure is accepted, the system reorganizes. Contrast this with open-ended stress. An unresolved conflict, an uncertain relationship, a probabilistic threat. These keep prediction alive indefinitely. The brain cannot grieve what has not clearly happened. It cannot act decisively without knowing what it is acting toward. Power stays engaged. Fragility becomes chronic. This is why modern life, despite reducing physical danger, increases mental strain. Many of its pressures are intentionally left open-ended. Careers do not end cleanly. They evolve. Social identity does not stabilize. It is curated. Information does not conclude. It updates. The brain is never told, unequivocally, that it is done. It keeps checking. Return again to the evolutionary trade-off. The brain's ability to hold open possibilities was once an advantage because the environment eventually forced closure. Now the environment defers closure. The brain waits in a permanent state of readiness. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It is suspended resolution. This also reframes the role of meaning. Meaning is often treated as something the brain seeks to feel better. In reality, meaning functions as a boundary. A clear sense of meaning tells the brain which futures matter and which do not. Without meaning, everything remains potentially relevant. The system must track it all. Fragility grows not because meaning is absent emotionally, but because relevance is unbounded cognitively. When meaning is vague or constantly renegotiated, the brain cannot prioritize effectively. The brain feels tired not because it is doing too much, but because it cannot decide what to stop doing. Power becomes diffuse. Fragility expresses itself as exhaustion without clear cause. Notice how often relief comes from decisions that reduce optionality. Committing to a path, even an imperfect one, can feel stabilizing because it closes off alternative futures. The brain trades some power for rest. It does not require certainty. It requires commitment. Commitment tells the predictive system, this branch is chosen. The others can be dropped, but commitment feels dangerous to a brain trained to maximize adaptability. What if the choice is wrong? What if conditions change? These questions reactivate prediction. Power resists narrowing. Fragility returns. The brain oscillates between wanting closure and fearing it. This oscillation is not a flaw of character. It is the natural tension inside a system designed to survive through openness. Now living in an environment that rarely forces resolution, the brain cannot resolve this tension alone. It needs external structures, rituals, rhythms, endings that it can trust. When those structures erode, fragility becomes internalized. And this is where the problem becomes generational rather than individual. Each new generation inherits a brain built for bounded futures and places it in a world of expanding ones. The brain adapts, but adaptation has a cost. Power stretches further. Fragility stretches with it. The margin for rest shrinks. We return, again, to the central question, not as repetition, but as alignment. The human brain is powerful because it can live beyond the present, and fragile because it cannot easily stop doing so. Every modern symptom we observe, restlessness, burnout, insomnia, emotional flattening, can be traced back to this single design tension. From here, the narrative will begin to converge toward the final arc. Not solutions in the simplistic sense, but conditions under which the brain's power and fragility can coexist without constant strain. This will involve understanding why certain limits feel safe, why others feel threatening, and how the brain recognizes the difference. Because the conditions that allow power and fragility to coexist are not created by effort, but by trust. The brain only releases prediction when it trusts that nothing essential is being missed. This trust cannot be commanded internally. It must be supplied externally, through structures that feel final enough to be believed. Without trust, every pause feels irresponsible. With trust, pause becomes possible. This is why artificial limits often fail. A timer telling the brain to stop working does not resolve the question of what remains undone. A forced break does not convince the system that future risk has disappeared. The brain does not respond to rules. It responds to credibility. It asks, implicitly, is this really over? If the answer is uncertain, prediction continues beneath the surface. Again, the root cause asserts itself. The brain's power lies in refusing to assume completion prematurely. This refusal saved lives in environments where danger returned quickly, but in environments where danger is abstract and ongoing, refusal becomes exhaustion. Fragility is not the inability to cope, it is the inability to conclude. Look closely at moments when the brain genuinely settles. They often involve clear transitions. Night falling, a door closing, a journey ending, a conversation reaching an unmistakable stop. These are not symbolic comforts. They are informational signals. They tell the brain that the current predictive loop can be shut down. When such signals are absent or ambiguous, the brain remains active even in stillness. Modern life strips away many of these signals. Work follows us home. Social presence extends through screens. News never finishes reporting. Even leisure is framed as improvement or recovery rather than completion. The brain never hears a convincing enough. This is also why nostalgia carries such weight. The past feels safer not because it was easier, but because it is closed. The brain does not need to simulate alternate outcomes for events that are finished. Memory may carry emotion, but it does not demand prediction. In contrast, the future is emotionally lighter, but cognitively heavier. Once more, the paradox becomes unavoidable. The same brain that longs for closure also resists it. Closure reduces optionality, and optionality once meant survival. The brain's fear of missing out is not cultural alone. It is evolutionary. Missing information once meant death. Today, it means discomfort, but the system does not recalibrate easily. Fragility emerges when the brain is caught between two incompatible imperatives. Stay open to maximize future advantage, and close to preserve present stability. The system oscillates, and the oscillation itself becomes tiring. This is why mental fatigue often feels different from physical fatigue. Physical fatigue follows expenditure. Mental fatigue follows suspension. It is the tiredness of holding something unfinished. The brain is not exhausted because it worked too hard, but because it never stopped working. At this point, it is essential to reject a comforting but false narrative that fragility means the brain is failing to adapt. In reality, the brain is adapting continuously. What it cannot adapt to is endless openness without consequence. Adaptation requires feedback. Feedback requires outcomes. Outcomes require endings. This brings the discussion back, once again, to the central cause, not as repetition but as reinforcement. The human brain is powerful because it treats the future as real, and fragile because it cannot tell when the future has become too large to manage. Every additional layer of abstraction, symbolic goals, imagined identities, probabilistic threats, expands the future without adding closure. Consider how the brain responds to certainty, even negative certainty. A definitive diagnosis, a final decision, an irreversible change. These can be emotionally painful, yet mentally stabilizing. The brain grieves, but it stops scanning. It reorganizes around what is now fixed. Power contracts slightly. Fragility eases. By contrast, prolonged uncertainty keeps the brain suspended. It cannot grieve. It cannot act decisively. It cannot rest. The system remains ready, indefinitely. This readiness was once adaptive. Now it is corrosive. Understanding this reframes many modern struggles. Burnout is not laziness. It is prediction without landing. Insomnia is not failure to relax. It is failure to conclude. Anxiety is not excess fear. It is excess future. These states differ in expression but share a common origin. The brain cannot find a believable endpoint. The uncomfortable implication is that relief does not come from adding more strategies, but from subtracting futures. This feels counterintuitive to a system that equates more options with safety. Yet safety, for the predictive brain, ultimately comes from knowing when it can stop looking. As we move closer to the final arc of the video, the focus will tighten on this single tension. How the brain recognizes real endings, why some boundaries calm it, while others provoke resistance, and why the modern world struggles to provide limits that feel trustworthy enough to allow the system to stand down. We are not yet at the endpoint, but we are approaching the region where the structure begins to converge rather than expand. Because the final convergence of this question is not philosophical, but structural. The brain does not ask for comfort. It asks for containment. It does not seek happiness first. It seeks completion. When completion is unavailable, it substitutes vigilance. Power remains engaged because disengagement feels unsafe. At the deepest level, the human brain evolved to answer one question over and over again. Is this resolved? When the answer is yes, resources release. When the answer is no, prediction continues. Modern fragility is the accumulation of too many unanswered no's. Not dramatic failures, but quiet incompletions that never fully close. This is why so many modern coping strategies feel hollow. They address sensation without addressing structure. Calming the nervous system helps temporarily, but if the underlying futures remain open, calm becomes another state the brain must maintain. It watches itself being calm. It evaluates whether calm is appropriate. Again, return to the root cause without deviation. The brain's power lies in its refusal to assume safety without evidence. Fragility arises when evidence never arrives. The system was designed to be skeptical of peace. Peace, in ancestral terms, was short-lived. Readiness mattered more. The modern world offers comfort without finality. It offers information without conclusion. It offers progress without arrival. The brain adapts by extending its predictive horizon further and further forward, hoping closure will eventually appear. It rarely does. This is where the sense of existential fatigue enters. Not fear, not sadness, but weariness with continuation itself. The brain is tired of carrying futures that do not crystallize. Meaning feels diluted not because it is absent, but because it is spread too thin across too many possibilities. Fragility becomes background noise. At this stage, the brain begins to experience narrowing as relief rather than threat. People crave routines, rituals, repetition, not because they lack imagination, but because imagination has been running unchecked. Repetition tells the brain, nothing new needs to be simulated here. For a moment, prediction can rest. This explains the paradoxical comfort of boredom. Boredom signals that the environment is not demanding anticipation. The brain complains initially because it is understimulated, but then it settles. Fragility softens. Power idles instead of racing. Yet boredom is stigmatized in a culture that equates stimulation with vitality. The brain is pushed back into openness, more input, more possibility, more future. The cycle resumes. Again, the issue is not stimulation itself, but endless stimulation without closure. A story that never ends, does not entertain. It exhausts. The brain needs arcs, not streams. It needs beginnings and endings, not perpetual middle. This brings the discussion to a critical turning point. If fragility is the cost of power, and power cannot be surrendered without losing what makes the brain human, then the task is not elimination, but calibration. The brain must be allowed to expand and then be allowed to stop. The tragedy of the modern condition is that stopping feels illegitimate. Rest must be justified. Stillness must be earned. Closure must be optimized. The brain never hears a convincing signal that it is allowed to disengage simply because it has done enough. Evolution never required justification for rest. Rest followed resolution, resolution followed action, action followed threat. The chain is broken now. Threat is abstract. Action is symbolic. Resolution is deferred. Rest becomes optional and fragile. Once more, the central question aligns everything that has come before it. The human brain is powerful because it can live beyond immediate reality, and fragile because it was never meant to do so continuously. Every modern strain can be traced back to this single mismatch. As we approach the final structural phase of the video, the narrative will begin to compress rather than expand. The goal will not be to offer techniques, but to clarify conditions, what kinds of endings the brain recognizes as real, why certain rhythms restore stability, and why fragility is not a sign of failure, but a signal that power has exceeded its ecological limits. The brain does not need to be fixed. It needs to be allowed to finish things. A finished outcome can be integrated. An unfinished one must be monitored. This distinction matters more than emotion. The brain can tolerate pain if it knows what the pain means. It struggles when meaning remains provisional. This is why rituals, across cultures and eras, have always mattered. Rituals manufacture endings where nature no longer provides them. They mark transitions as real, even when consequences are symbolic. A ritual tells the brain, this phase is complete, you can release it. Fragility eases not because the ritual solves the problem, but because it closes the loop. Modern life replaces ritual with optimization. Instead of endings, there are upgrades. Instead of closure, there are iterations. The brain adapts by staying open. It keeps score. It tracks deltas. Power remains engaged because there is always a next version. Return again to the core mechanism without deviation. The predictive brain requires believable endpoints to regulate itself. Without them, it defaults to vigilance. Vigilance is not anxiety. It is preparedness without discharge. Over time, preparedness becomes strain. This helps explain why clarity is so often confused with control. Control attempts to manage outcomes. Clarity accepts outcomes. The brain relaxes under clarity because it knows where it stands. It tightens under control because control implies that the future is still negotiable. Power prefers control. Fragility prefers clarity. The two are often at odds. At a physiological level, this tension manifests as cycles that never fully close. Neural networks responsible for monitoring threat, reward, and relevance remain partially active. The brain does not enter deep recovery states easily. Sleep becomes lighter. Attention fragments. Emotion flattens. None of this indicates collapse. It indicates prolonged partial engagement. Again, the brain is not weak. It is precise. It refuses to disengage without credible evidence that disengagement is safe. The problem is that safety has become statistical rather than experiential. Probabilities do not end. They update. The brain keeps calculating. Consider how different this is from environments where danger was immediate and concrete. A predator appears. Action occurs. The outcome is clear. The loop closes. Even loss closes the loop. Modern dangers rarely do this. They hover, they trend, they remain possible. The brain treats possibility as unfinished business. This is why narratives matter more than facts. A narrative provides sequence and end. Facts provide data without closure. A brain fed only facts remains active. A brain given a narrative can rest, even if the narrative is imperfect. Fragility increases when narratives fragment faster than they can be completed. Notice how the brain responds to stories with endings. Tension builds, resolves, and releases. This is not entertainment alone. It is regulation. The brain practices closure safely. When life itself stops offering endings, stories become compensatory. They simulate what reality withholds. Once more, the central paradox aligns. The human brain is powerful because it can keep futures open, and fragile because it cannot live indefinitely without closing them. The same ability that enables long-term planning makes indefinite uncertainty intolerable. As the narrative compresses toward its final shape, one implication becomes unavoidable. Fragility is not something to be eliminated without cost. Remove fragility entirely, and you remove sensitivity to the future. You remove foresight, caution, imagination. You remove what allowed the species to outlast others. The goal cannot be invulnerability. It must be balance. Balance, however, does not come from internal effort alone. The brain cannot decide to be balanced any more than it can decide to stop predicting. Balance emerges when environments provide credible boundaries, when days end, when tasks end, when roles end, when identities are allowed to be sufficient rather than optimal. This is why environments that enforce rhythm, clear work boundaries, seasonal cycles, shared rituals produce calmer minds without reducing intelligence. They give power a place to expand and a place to stop. Fragility recedes not because the brain is numbed, but because it is finally convinced it can stand down. We return, one final time in this arc, to the question that has guided everything. Why is the human brain so powerful yet so fragile? Because it evolved to survive by staying ahead of reality, and it still believes that stopping is dangerous. Power keeps it alive. Fragility reminds it when it has gone too far. The conclusion is not comforting, but it is clarifying. There is nothing wrong with a brain that feels strained in a world without endings. The strain is evidence of capacity misaligned with context. Understanding this does not solve the problem instantly, but it reframes it. The brain does not need to be fought. It needs to be given believable places to finish. Because once the brain is finally allowed to finish something, it reveals a truth that is easy to miss when everything is open-ended. Fragility is not constant. It fluctuates with context. When the brain senses genuine completion, even briefly, its tone changes. Muscles soften. Thoughts slow. Time feels thicker. This is not relaxation as an achievement. It is regulation as a consequence. The brain was never meant to maintain peak openness indefinitely. Its strength lies in expansion and contraction, in reaching forward and then returning. The problem is not that modern life demands expansion, but that it rarely permits return. The system stretches and stretches, and eventually stretch is mistaken for baseline. This normalization is dangerous not because it breaks the brain suddenly, but because it erodes sensitivity to overload. When constant anticipation becomes familiar, the brain stops signaling clearly. Fatigue turns quiet. Motivation thins, meaning dulls. The system adapts by lowering intensity across the board. Power remains, but it is muted, spread thinly across too many open loops. Again, return to the central cause to anchor the drift. The brain is powerful because it can hold futures open, and fragile because those futures must eventually close to maintain coherence. A brain that never closes loops does not collapse immediately. It slowly loses contrast. Everything feels equally urgent and equally flat. This is not failure. It is saturation. At this stage, the brain begins to seek artificial closure wherever it can find it. Endless scrolling mimics continuation without commitment. Repetitive tasks provide predictable endings. Even self-criticism can function as a boundary. It hurts, but it concludes something. The brain prefers painful certainty to endless ambiguity. This preference is not irrational. It is regulatory. This sheds light on why many people feel relief after making difficult decisions, even when the outcome is objectively worse. The relief does not come from the result, but from the end of simulation. Once a choice is locked in, alternative futures lose relevance. The brain stops branching. Power disengages. Fragility recedes, at least temporarily. Notice how often the brain resists decisions not because it lacks information, but because it fears losing optionality. Optionality feels like safety, yet optionality without limit becomes threat. The brain oscillates, trapped between expansion and exhaustion. This oscillation is the lived experience of modern mental strain. The deeper issue is that the brain cannot easily tell the difference between meaningful openness and meaningless excess. It treats both as potentially important. Filtering requires context. Context requires boundaries. When boundaries dissolve, everything competes for relevance. Attention fragments, not from weakness, but from democratic overload. This is why simplicity can feel calming even when it is objectively restrictive. Simplicity reduces future space. It tells the brain, there is less to track, less to simulate, less to prepare for. Power relaxes, not because the brain is underused, but because it is no longer forced to be everywhere at once. Yet simplicity is often framed as regression or lack of ambition. The brain absorbs this message and resists narrowing. It keeps pushing outward, mistaking breadth for vitality. Fragility grows quietly beneath the surface. Again, the pattern repeats because it must. The brain is not broken. It is responding logically to incentives that reward openness without closure. The strain we feel is not personal inadequacy. It is systemic misalignment, a future-oriented organ placed in a future infinite environment. As we approach the final stretch of this exploration, one realization becomes unavoidable. The human brain cannot be made less fragile without also being made less powerful. Any attempt to harden it completely would require sealing it off from possibility, imagination, and anticipation. That would protect it, but it would also diminish what it can do. The alternative is not to eliminate fragility, but to respect it. Fragility is feedback. It signals that the system is being asked to operate without sufficient endpoints. Ignoring that signal leads to dullness. Responding to it requires creating conditions where power can cycle rather than accumulate. These conditions are not internal tricks. They are structural realities, clear endings, trustworthy boundaries, rhythms that do not require constant negotiation. When such conditions exist, the brain does not need to be convinced to rest. It rests because resting makes sense. This brings us to the edge of the conclusion where everything converges rather than expands. The brain's greatest strength, its ability to live ahead of itself, cannot be separated from its greatest vulnerability. The question was never how to remove fragility, but how to live with it without being consumed by it. Understanding this does not solve the problem instantly, but it reframes the struggle. A fragile brain is not a failed brain. It is a powerful one, operating without enough places to stop. And it is precisely within that low-grade, lingering exhaustion that the body begins to reveal very subtle signs almost no one notices. Not sharp pain, not obvious illness, but tiny shifts in the way we respond to the world. Short-term memory becomes fragmented. Emotions fluctuate without clear reason. Simple decisions start taking longer, as if the brain were operating inside a thin yet persistent fog. Poor sleep does not destroy a person loudly. It does it quietly. Over time, the brain loses its ability to clearly distinguish what matters from what doesn't. A sense of overload appears even when we are doing very little. A normal day alone can feel mentally heavy. What's striking is that the human body was never designed to adapt to modern life in the way we now force it to. Tens of thousands of years of evolution tied sleep tightly to natural light, to a clear and stable day-night cycle. But in just a few decades, artificial lighting, glowing screens, and constant noise have fractured that biological rhythm. The body still tries to obey its internal clock, but the clock is constantly being contradicted. Melatonin is delayed. Cortisol rises at the wrong time. The brain receives mixed signals. Stay alert, but prepare to rest. Stay awake, but slow down. Over time, this confusion becomes the new normal. We stop feeling truly sleepy, yet never feel fully awake. We lie in bed, physically exhausted, while the mind keeps running, replaying fragments of the day, unfinished thoughts, meaningless worries, and slowly, without a clear moment of collapse, rest stops being restorative. Sleep becomes shallow. In the morning, the body gets up, but something essential remains behind, as if part of the mind never fully returned. This is not insomnia as a disorder. This is a quiet mismatch between biology and environment. A system working continuously under conditions it was never built to handle. And the most unsettling part is not how tired we feel, but how normal that tiredness has become. Eventually, the brain adapts not by fixing the problem, but by lowering its expectations. It stops demanding deep rest because deep rest no longer arrives. Instead, it learns to function on fragments, micro-recoveries, short, unstable pauses that keep us alive but never fully restored. From the outside, life continues normally. From the inside, everything runs slightly underpowered. This is why chronic sleep loss rarely feels dramatic. There is no single breaking point, no clear before and after. What changes is the baseline. Focus that once felt effortless now requires effort. Motivation becomes inconsistent. Curiosity fades first, then patience, then joy. Not because we are unhappy, but because the brain no longer has the surplus energy required to generate those states. Over time, the body begins reallocating resources. Repair is postponed. Immune responses weaken. Hormonal balance shifts subtly but persistently. Inflammation rises just enough to matter, not enough to alarm. Aging accelerates not in appearance, but in recovery. Cuts heal slower. Stress lingers longer. Emotional wounds take more time to close. And yet, we continue telling ourselves we are fine, because the system still works. We still wake up, still perform tasks, still function, but function is not the same as thrive. The human brain evolved to operate with regular, deep, uninterrupted sleep, not as a luxury, but as maintenance. Remove that maintenance, and the system does not stop. It degrades. What makes this especially dangerous is that awareness disappears along with energy. A tired brain is a poor judge of its own condition. The more exhausted we become, the more we normalize exhaustion, the less we remember what clarity once felt like. This creates a feedback loop. Poor sleep reduces insight, reduced insight prevents correction, and the cycle reinforces itself quietly. In this state, rest is often confused with distraction. We scroll, we watch, we consume, but none of it restores. The nervous system remains engaged, stimulated, alert. Even moments labeled as relaxation keep the brain active. True rest, biological disengagement becomes rare, and so the question is no longer why we sleep poorly. The question becomes deeper and more uncomfortable. What parts of ourselves have we already lost without realizing it, simply because we no longer rest deeply enough to notice their absence?